I was 55 years old when I realized I didn't want to die in the United States. That thought hit me one evening as I sat alone in my apartment, sipping a beer and scrolling through endless news reports about rising taxes, crime, and the general decay of everything around me. I had done everything right worked my whole life, saved responsibly, avoided debt, and yet retirement in America felt like a slow death. The cost of living was ridiculous, healthcare was a joke, and worst of all, I felt completely disconnected from people. Everyone was too busy, too stressed, too caught up in their own problems to genuinely connect. I wasn't the kind of man who made impulsive decisions, but I also wasn't going to spend my so-called golden years waiting to die in some overpriced retirement home. I started looking at options. I wanted a place where my money would stretch further, where I could live well without constantly worrying about bills, and maybe find a little happiness. That's how I discovered the Philippines. It started with a few YouTube videos. Older guys, mostly Americans and Australians, talking about how life was cheap, women were beautiful, and the beaches looked like something out of a travel magazine. I was skeptical at first. It all seemed too good to be true, but the more I researched, the more I saw the potential. I joined online forums, read blogs, and even connected with a few expats who had already made the move. They told me about the warm culture, the slower pace of life, and the fact that a decent apartment could cost less than what I spent on utilities back home. It sounded perfect. Of course, I had my concerns. I had never been to Asia before. I didn't know a single word of Tagalog, and I wasn't sure how people would react to a foreigner like me moving into their country. But the alternative, staying in a place where I was miserable, seemed far worse. So I made a plan. I sold my house, liquidated most of my assets, and set aside a comfortable amount of money to ensure I wouldn't end up broke in a foreign country. I didn't want to be one of those idiots who thought moving abroad was a magic solution to all their problems, only to end up penniless and begging for a ticket home. The flight to Manila was brutal. Over 20 hours in a cramped seat, surrounded by strangers, questioning if I was making the biggest mistake of my life. But when I stepped off that plane, into the thick, humid air of the Philippines, I told myself there was no turning back. Manila was overwhelming. The traffic was relentless, an endless sea of cars, motorcycles, and jeepneys honking and swerving in every direction. The air was thick with exhaust fumes, street food, and a kind of tropical heat that made my shirt stick to my back within minutes. I had booked a hotel in Makati, the business district, thinking it would be a good place to get my bearings. It was modern, full of skyscrapers, and familiar enough to not feel completely foreign. But it didn't take long to realize that this city wasn't the paradise I had imagined. Everything was loud. The streets were packed with people. Sidewalks were crowded with vendors selling everything from fruit to bootleg DVDs. It was a strange mix of extreme wealth and deep poverty. One moment, I'd be standing in front of a luxury mall, watching well-dressed Filipinos carrying shopping bags filled with expensive brands, and the next, I'd turn a corner and see entire families living under tarps on the side of the road. It was a contrast I wasn't prepared for. And then there was the language barrier. People spoke English, sure, but it wasn't the English I was used to. Some spoke it fluently, others in a mix of Tagalog and heavily accented words that I struggled to understand. I found myself repeating, "Sorry, what was that?" more times than I could count. It was exhausting. The first few days were a blur of confusion. Simple things like ordering food, finding a grocery store, or even crossing the street felt like challenges. The currency conversion threw me off. I knew my money went further here, but I had no real sense of what things should cost. Was I being overcharged? Was I getting a good deal? I had no idea. And then came the real test, meeting people. I hadn't thought much about how difficult it would be to form connections in a new country. Back home, I barely spoke to my neighbors, but here I was suddenly aware of how isolated I was. I sat alone in restaurants, walked the busy streets with no real direction, and spent my evenings scrolling through my phone, wondering if I had made a huge mistake. One evening, I wandered into a bar in Makati that I had seen recommended online. It was filled with other foreigners, mostly older men, drinking and chatting with young, beautiful Filipinas. I took a seat at the bar and ordered a beer, watching the scene unfold around me. Within minutes, a woman approached me, smiling warmly. She was maybe in her late 20s, dressed in a tight dress, and spoke in perfect rehearsed English. "Hi, handsome," she said, leaning in slightly. "First time in the Philippines?" I nodded, unsure how to respond. She asked where I was from, how long I was staying, if I was single. It was clear she had done this before. There was an ease in the way she spoke, a confidence that made it obvious she knew exactly what she was doing. I wasn't naive. I knew about the reputation of these bars, about the women who worked them, looking for older foreign men willing to spend money. But sitting there, alone, tired, and overwhelmed, it was hard not to enjoy the attention. She laughed at my jokes, touched my arm when she spoke, and made me feel like, for the first time since arriving, I wasn't just another stranger lost in the city. But then came the moment I had been expecting. "Would you like to buy me a drink?" she asked, tilting her head slightly, her smile never fading. It was a simple question, but in that instant, something in me shifted. I realized I wasn't special. I wasn't being approached because of my charm or personality. I was just another foreigner with money in his pocket. I bought her the drink. I stayed for another hour, letting her tell me stories, letting myself believe just for a moment that maybe, just maybe, I had found something real. But when I left that night, walking alone back to my hotel, the truth settled in. I wasn't in paradise. I wasn't in some dreamland where life was easy and beautiful women genuinely wanted to be with men like me. I was in a foreign country, alone, trying to figure out if I had made the right decision. And for the first time since arriving, I wasn't sure if I had. The morning after that first night at the bar, I woke up with a dull headache, not from alcohol, since I'd only had a couple of beers, but from the weight of realization. The excitement of moving to the Philippines had been replaced by something heavier, something more uncomfortable. Was I just another foreigner who thought he could escape his problems in a country he barely understood? I spent the next few days trying to adjust. I walked through Makati, getting a feel for the city, but something felt off. It was modern, sure tall buildings, high-end malls, international restaurants, but it didn't feel like the real Philippines. I wanted to see the country beyond the corporate district, so I decided to explore further. A taxi driver I had befriended, Joel, offered to take me around Manila. He was in his late 40s, had a permanent smile, and was always talking, sometimes to me, sometimes to himself, sometimes to whoever was on the other end of his phone. He drove me through different parts of the city, pointing out landmarks, giving me unsolicited advice about staying safe, and sharing his thoughts on foreigners who moved to the Philippines. "Many Americans come here looking for young wives," he said, glancing at me through the rearview mirror. "Some find good ones, some get tricked. You have to be careful." I told him I wasn't looking for a wife. "Maybe not now," he said, laughing, "but soon you will. Philippines is like that, you'll see." The more we drove, the more I saw how different the city was depending on where you went. In one area, glass skyscrapers and expensive condos. A few streets away, crumbling buildings and kids playing barefoot in alleyways. The poverty was unavoidable. In America, we hid it. Here, it was everywhere, woven into the very fabric of life. At one point, Joel drove through Ermita, an area I had read about but wasn't sure I wanted to see firsthand. It had a reputation. Bars, clubs, women standing outside, smiling at passing cars, waiting for foreigners with thick wallets. I saw older men, gray-haired and pot-bellied, walking hand in hand with women who looked young enough to be their daughters. Some people would say they were taking advantage of the situation. Others would say both sides knew exactly what they were getting into. I didn't know what to think. That night, I sat in my hotel room, staring out the window at the lights of the city, wondering what the hell I was doing. I had left the United States for a better life, but was I really finding it? Sure, my dollar stretched further here, but was that enough? Was it enough to be in a place where I didn't really belong, where every interaction felt transactional? I needed a change of scenery. I booked a flight to Cebu, an island city known for its beaches, smaller expat community, and supposedly more relaxed way of life. If Manila wasn't what I was looking for, maybe Cebu would be. When I landed, the air felt differentless, suffocating, less chaotic. The city was still busy, but the energy was calmer. I checked into a small hotel near Fuente Osmeña, a central area with restaurants, shops, and a mix of locals and foreigners. My plan was simple: take it slow, observe, and figure out if this was the place I could actually see myself living. On my first night, I walked around, stopping at a local restaurant that had been recommended online. As I ate, I noticed a group of older expats sitting at a nearby table. They were loud, laughing, drinking, telling stories. I debated whether or not to introduce myself, but before I could make a decision, one of them waved me over. "New guy?" he asked, grinning. I nodded, pulling up a chair. The group was a mix-an Australian, a Brit, 2 Americans, all of them retired, all of them having lived in the Philippines for years. They didn't hold back. "You're in the honeymoon phase," the Brit said, sipping his beer. "Everything's exciting. Everything's new. That won't last." I asked what he meant. Eventually, you'll either adapt or you'll leave, he said. Most guys don't last more than a year. They come here thinking it's paradise, then reality hits. Some make it work. Others go home broke and bitter. I wanted to argue, but I couldn't. I had already seen glimpses of what he was talking about. The Australian leaned in. Let me guess you're here for a fresh start, yeah? Maybe find a nice Filipina, live out your days in peace? I shrugged. Just remember, he said, this place isn't as cheap as you think, and love isn't as simple as it looks. The night went on, and the stories kept coming. Some were hilarious, some depressing. Expats who had lost everything to women who played the long con. Men who thought they had found true love, only to realize they were just another paycheck. But there were also stories of guys who made it work, who found real relationships, who built new lives they wouldn't trade for anything. By the time I left, my head was spinning not from alcohol, but from the realization that my adventure was just beginning, and I had no idea where it would take me. As I walked back to my hotel, I wondered, was I going to be one of the ones who adapted, or one of the ones who failed? And more importantly, did I even know what I really wanted? Cebu felt different. Manila had been a sensory overload, loud, chaotic, exhausting. But here, things moved at a slightly slower pace. The air was cleaner, the streets less congested, and the people seemed more relaxed. It still wasn't the quiet paradise I had imagined, but it felt like a step in the right direction. I rented a small condo in a decent part of the city, a place called IT Park. It was a bubble modern, safe, full of coffee shops and restaurants. There were foreigners like me everywhere, blending in with young professionals who worked in call centers servicing American customers through the night. It felt familiar enough to be comfortable, but still different enough to remind me I wasn't home. For the first week, I did what most expats do when they arrive. I played tourist. I took a ferry to Bohol, saw the chocolate hills, rented a motorbike, and rode through winding mountain roads that led to untouched beaches. I went snorkeling in Molbol, swam with sardines in the open sea, and drank cold San Miguel beers while watching the sun set over the water. It was beautiful. It was exactly what I had envisioned when I first dreamed of leaving the US. But then, reality set in. Vacations are easy. Living is different. Once the excitement of being in a new place started to fade, the same feelings from Manila crept back in. The loneliness, the sense of being an outsider, the realization that I had no real connections here. I spent most of my days alone, eating alone, walking alone. The expat groups I had met were friendly, but there was something about them that didn't sit right with me. Most of them had settled into predictable routines, waking up late, spending their afternoons in bars, rotating through young girlfriends until they found one who would stay. It was a lifestyle that seemed easy to fall into, but I wasn't sure if I wanted that. Then there were the women. If you're a foreigner in the Philippines, especially an older one, you'll never lack attention. That was something I learned fast. It wasn't just in the bars, it was everywhere. In malls, in grocery stores, even just walking down the street. Young, beautiful women would smile, some would start conversations, others would add me on Facebook out of nowhere. At first, it was flattering. Back in the US, I was invisible. Here, I felt seen. But the more it happened, the more I started questioning it. Was it really me they were interested in, or just what I represented? One night, I met a woman named Eileen. She was 28, worked at a hotel, and had a smile that could disarm anyone. We met at a cafe, and within minutes, I could tell she was different. She didn't ask about my income. She didn't hint at needing help. She just talked about her life, her family, her struggles. I found myself listening, actually listening, in a way I hadn't in years. We started seeing each other regularly. Dinners, beach trips, late-night conversations. She was kind, affectionate, but also guarded. She had seen too many women get their hearts broken by foreigners who made promises they never intended to keep. One night, as we sat by the water in Mactan, she looked at me and asked a question I wasn't prepared for. Why did you really come here? It caught me off guard. I had answered that question 100 times before, but always with the same rehearsed lines. Better life, lower cost of living, escape from the stress of America. But sitting there, staring at the gentle waves, I realized those were only half-truths. I had come here because I was running from loneliness, from the feeling of being forgotten, from the nagging fear that I had wasted too much time chasing things that never really mattered. I didn't say that, though. Instead, I shrugged. I needed a change. She studied me for a moment, then smiled. Maybe change is good. Maybe, but change wasn't easy. As the weeks passed, I started noticing things I hadn't before. how locals saw foreigners, how everything in some way had a financial undercurrent. Relationships, friendships there was always an invisible line, a silent expectation. It wasn't necessarily malicious. In a country where poverty was everywhere, survival came first. If you had money, you were in a different world, a world where people treated you with kindness, not always because they wanted to, but because they had to. I didn't want to believe Eileen was like that. But doubt crept in. Then, one night, she asked if I could help her with something. Her sister needed money for school. It wasn't a lot, nothing that would affect me. But the moment she asked, something in my stomach tightened. Was this what it always came down to? I told her I needed to think about it. She nodded, understanding, but I saw something shift in her eyes. A disappointment. Maybe she had hoped I was different. Maybe I had hoped the same. That night, as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, I wondered if I had been fooling myself this entire time. Maybe paradise wasn't real. Maybe it was just another illusion. And maybe I had walked straight into it, believing it was something it never was. I woke up the next morning with a knot in my stomach. Something about my conversation with Eileen had unsettled me. It wasn't just the request for money, it was what it represented. I had come to the Philippines looking for something real. A new life, a fresh start, maybe even a meaningful relationship. But now, I wasn't sure if any of that was possible. Was everything here transactional? Were relationships just another part of the economic equation? I needed to clear my head. I decided to take a trip south, away from the city, to a place called Oslab. It was known for its whale sharks, but I wasn't interested in that. I just wanted space, a break from everything. I rented a small cottage by the beach, nothing fancy, just a simple place with a hammock and a view of the water. For the first time since arriving in the Philippines, I was truly alone. No city noise, no expat conversations, no women smiling at me with expectations in their eyes, just the sound of the waves and the occasional laughter of local kids playing in the distance. I spent the day walking along the shore, letting the water wash over my feet, trying to untangle the thoughts in my head. Was I being paranoid? Was I overthinking everything? Maybe Eileen's request wasn't a test. Maybe she genuinely needed help and saw me as someone she could trust. Or maybe I was just another foreigner with a wallet and she was playing the long game. That night, as I sat outside watching the stars, I thought about home, about what I had left behind. America wasn't perfect, but at least I understood it. I understood the culture, the rules, the expectations. Here, I was constantly second-guessing everything. Was someone being friendly because they liked me, or because they saw an opportunity? Was I building relationships, or just buying them? I had always been a practical man. Back home, I could read people easily. I knew when someone was lying, when someone was trying to manipulate me. But here, everything was different. The culture, the body language, the way people spoke, it was all unfamiliar, and that made me vulnerable. I thought about leaving, just packing up and going home before I got in too deep, before I made a mistake I couldn't undo. But then, what was I going back to? A life I had already decided wasn't worth staying for? The next morning, I got a message from Eileen. I hope you're okay. I didn't mean to upset you. If you don't want to help, I understand. I stared at the screen for a long time before replying. It's not about the money. It's about trust. I need to know what's real. She didn't respond right away. When she finally did, her message was short. I understand. I didn't know if that was a good thing or a bad thing. I spent another 2 days in Oslo before heading back to Cebu. By the time I returned, something had changed. I didn't feel as lost. I wasn't sure if I had found answers, but at least I had accepted the questions. Eileen and I met for dinner a few days later. There was no tension, no awkwardness. She didn't bring up money again. We just talked, like we always had. And for the first time, I started to believe that maybe, just maybe, she was different. But doubt is a tricky thing. Once it creeps in, it never fully leaves. And I had the feeling that sooner or later, I'd find out if I was right to trust her, if I was just another fool learning the hard way. I kept seeing Eileen, but something inside me had changed. Doubt had settled in like an unwelcome guest, and no matter how much I tried to ignore it, it lingered in the background of every conversation, every smile, every touch. I told myself I was being unfair, that I was carrying my own insecurities like baggage from a past life. But was I? Or was I finally waking up to a truth I had been trying to ignore? A few weeks passed and things seemed normal. We went on weekend trips, ate at small local restaurants where she introduced me to food I never would have ordered on my own. She taught me bits of Cebuano, laughing every time I butchered the pronunciation. It felt real, but then again, everything feels real until it isn't. Then one night, everything changed. We were having dinner at a small cafe when her phone buzzed. Normally, she ignored it when we were together, but this time, she glanced at the screen and her face tensed up just for a second. But I saw it. "Everything okay?" I asked. She hesitated before forcing a smile. "Yeah, just my sister." I nodded, but my gut told me otherwise. A few minutes later, her phone buzzed again. She turned it over this time, hiding the screen. Something wasn't right. I tried to let it go, but my mind wouldn't stop spinning. Who was texting her? Why was she suddenly nervous? I had told myself I wasn't going to be that guy, the paranoid expat who assumes every woman is playing him, but my instincts were screaming at me. After dinner, she said she needed to head home early. Something about her family needing her. I didn't push. I just nodded and watched her disappear into the night, but I wasn't done. I sat there for a long time, staring at my drink, debating what to do next. Then, without fully thinking it through, I opened Facebook and searched for her profile. I had never been the jealous type, but something about this didn't sit right with me. Her profile was mostly normal pictures of us together, selfies, posts about her job. But then I saw something odd. A comment on one of her older photos. A simple heart emoji from a man I didn't recognize. I clicked his profile. American. Older than me. Based in Cebu. My stomach tightened. I scrolled through his page, and then I saw it. A picture of Eileen. Not just any picture I had taken of her during our trip to Bohol. And underneath, his caption, "Can't wait to see you again, my love." I felt like I had been punched in the gut. I sat there, gripping my phone, my mind racing. This couldn't be what it looked like. Maybe he was just some guy who had a crush on her. Maybe he was someone from her past. Maybe. But then I saw her reply. A simple smiley face and a heart. I closed my eyes, exhaling slowly. There it was. The truth I had been trying so hard not to see. I had been played. Not in some grand dramatic way. Not in a way that would make headlines or turn into a cautionary tale on an expat forum. But in the quiet, subtle way that so many men before me had been. I wasn't special. I wasn't different. I was just another guy with a wallet. I should have felt angry, but mostly I just felt tired. Tired of believing. Tired of hoping. Tired of thinking that maybe, just maybe, this time would be different. I didn't text her that night. Or the next. When she finally reached out, asking if everything was okay, I simply replied, "Yeah, I just need some time." She didn't ask why. Maybe she already knew. Or maybe she didn't care.